Galo went to the same undergraduate university as Santiago. I don't know whether you guys knew each other back then. And
we did.
You did, okay. It's a small world in Quito, in Ecuador.
It's a small country.
Then went to Ohio University, where he did his master's in environmental studies, working on sort of designing reserve networks for the Ecuadorian Amazon. And his PhD was here with Lynn Branch, the same advisor as Santiago's advisor, where he examined the impacts of domestic dogs on native mammals in the Andes of Ecuador. He's been working for Wildlife Conservation Society for almost 20 years, not quite, since 2001. And he's currently the science director for WCS's Ecuador program. And he does a lot of different things for WCS. He works with reserve networks, community-based wildlife management, the mitigation of human-wildlife conflict, as well as wildlife monitoring at landscape scales. And he doesn't just confine himself to the Amazon, he also has continued work in the Andes as well as in the Choco wet forests. He's got more than almost 25, 30 publications, and I mention this because I just noticed on your CV, Galo, that your most recent one in animal conservation, everybody knows me, I have golden retrievers, right? So I kind of like dogs a little bit. But the title of it I thought was very clever. Dogs are more than wet kisses and tail wags. Domestic dogs as invasive species. In this story, dogs are bad, let me tell you that. But with that, let me turn it over to Galo. Thank you, Galo, for joining us.
Thank you, Betty and Marianne, for the invitation. I'm very happy to join you in this class. So I'm going to present to you a summary of what we have learned during the last 10 to 15 years about hunting and wildlife management in Ecuador. And Ecuador is a fairly small country. It's about the size of Texas, and it's one of the most biodiverse countries on Earth. However, it has more than 16 million people, maybe 17 million now, and is the densest and fastest growing country in South America. So this translates directly in a very high demand for natural resources. And we have worked with several different indigenous groups, and we know that they consume daily an average of 70 grams of wild meat per person. And that's a very important amount because it's very healthy for their diets. But in addition to this nutritional value, also wildlife is very important because it has social and cultural values. It's part of the mythology and belief systems and religion of local people. And it's also important for making tools and other adornments. The problem now is that hunting is not sustainable in Ecuador. And this is very sad because it is true not only for people living in degraded areas and those in market economies, but it's also true for indigenous societies that hunt for subsistence only. And if hunting is not sustainable, then hunting produces negative ecological impacts. For example, reduces population densities of hunted species by 90%. And you can see a map of Yasuni National Park here, and Santiago talked about this park in his presentation. And in the northwestern section of the park, there are almost no animals left because people hunt for subsistence and also for commercial purposes. So we have here this phenomenon of the empty forest. And also hunting changes the composition of the biological community, and these changes can have wide repercussions on the ecosystem. Already mentioned the problem with hunting and wildlife and jaguar densities, but if jaguars disappear, then there's no species that's going to regulate the demographics of smaller species like agoutis. And then in the long term, the structure of the forest is going to change. But if hunting is unsustainable, it also produces negative social impacts. Right now in the Ecuadorian Amazon, 60% of people still hunt, and wildlife is still their daily source of protein. If wildlife disappears, more than $50 million per year would be needed to provide the same average amount of meat from domestic animals. So this is a very huge problem if wildlife disappears. But before that happens, people would have to switch to smaller species. but small mammals are not an efficient source of meat. While communities in the Amazon are consuming 70 grams per person per day of wild meat, in northwestern Ecuador, where deforestation rates have been very high during the last 100 years, people are hunting only very small mammals like marsupials and rodents, and they only get 5 grams per person per day. And this is not enough to be considered a healthy diet. It's a very complex issue because for hunting to be sustainable, it must be both ecologically and socially sustainable. And this is very hard to get in the real world. So the social part, it has to do with the need of people, and the ecological part, it has to do with the production of wildlife. There are a series of factors that affect sustainability of hunting, and I cannot talk about all of them right now, but Santiago mentioned roads, and the increased accessibility through roads and rivers is very important. The more accessible an area is, the more impact of hunting it's going to be in that area. And you can see here it's the northern part of Yasuni National Park, and along there are 2 main roads in that section, and you can see that there are big difference in biomass in the area. So we have here an area that's far from roads, and there are more than 4,000 kilograms per square kilometer of wildlife species, mainly wildly peccaries, while in the most degraded areas, there are less than 100 kilograms per square kilometer of biomass of wild mammals. There are also a problem with the carrying capacity of tropical forests. The Western Amazon has a carrying capacity of about 1 person per square kilometer. If they want to live only using hunting as their main source of protein. The problem is that in Ecuador, in eastern Ecuador, in the Amazon, population density currently is more than 6 people per square kilometer. And there's also been lots of changes in the technology for hunting, the use of firearms, flashlights, outboard motors. It makes the impact of hunting more severe in large areas of the Amazon. And many people have now access to wild meat markets. And if you are an indigenous person in the middle of the Amazon and you have access to a wild meat market, you will start selling meat, that's for sure. So in this context, we've been working in wildlife management at the community level, and it's interesting that hunting patterns show great heterogeneity among local communities. So wildlife management strategies should be site-specific. And we also have to take into account that local communities are not homogeneous entities. There are different groups with different interests and with different power levels, and that they also show different patterns of wildlife use. In this graph, you can see different areas around a local community called Warins in southeastern Ecuador. And you can see that men, women, and children use different areas of their territory for hunting and for collecting other non-timber forest products. So it's very important to take into account that communities are formed by different groups, and you have to take into account when managing wildlife, all those different groups. So I'm going to mention very rapidly some examples of wildlife management strategies we've been implementing with local communities. For example, people have to prohibit hunting by outsiders. It's very important to protect trees that are important food sources for wildlife, like palm trees and other trees like ficus. It's very important to establish hunting zones. So the communities have a community reserve and also a very clearly marked hunting area. In many cases, people still use their traditional weapons. So in those cases, it's very important to use, for example, blowguns instead of shotguns. It's very important to prohibit hunting with dogs. Dogs are a very effective hunting weapon and make the hunters very, very effective. In the Ecuadorian Amazon, even primates are hunted with dogs. People have to hunt only what the family needs, and commercial hunting should be prohibited. It's important to allocate quotas. These quotas can be by age, So people only can hunt adult animals by season. In the case of Eastern Ecuador, this is the months of February, March, and April. In Western Ecuador, this is September, October, and November. And for very sensitive species, it's very important to have complete quotas by species. So it's banned the hunting of tapirs and wildlife peccaries. In some areas, fishing is an important resource for people, so that might be an important strategy to rotate hunting with fishing activities. And given there's such a high density of people in the Ecuadorian Amazon, it's very important to have alternative sources of protein, like chickens, or also fish farming with native fish species. And when you implement community-based wildlife management strategies, it's very important to have a monitoring program because it works as a feedback mechanism. It's important for this monitoring program to be a participatory process, so it's the hunters who are monitoring the prey species they use, and it also helps you work in an adaptive management framework. You can see some of the results of these community-based wildlife management plans, and it works fairly well for small-sized and medium-sized species. It doesn't work that well for tapirs and wildlife peccaries. This is maybe because we need more time to monitor these populations and really find differences. Or it's maybe that our strategies are not good enough for protecting these species, and the hunting of these species should be banned completely. The problem now is that we've been implementing these strategies for the last 15, 20 years in Ecuador, in other areas of the Amazon for a much longer time, like in Peru and Bolivia. The thing is that the context in which subsistence hunting is taking place right now is changing rapidly. There's more habitat loss and fragmentation than 10 years ago. The human population growth is very high, and there's also climate change. So the prospect is not good, but we have to continue working with the communities to make sure they can continue hunting. The idea is not for them to stop hunting, but to continue hunting and make sure they can satisfy their needs at the same time that they do not cause the extinction of the species they use. And that's what I wanted to tell you today.